What if the biggest mistake the WNBA veterans ever made wasn't underestimating Caitlin Clark's talent? What if it was underestimating her inevitability? Because something just shifted. And it didn't shift quietly. It shifted publicly. Corporate publicly. Contractually publicly. And if you've been paying attention, you can feel it. For the last 2 years, we've watched what looked like competition. Hard fouls. Cold shoulders. Olympic debates. Podcast shots. Subtle dismissals disguised as welcome to the league energy. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Control. Veterans weren't just protecting tradition. They were protecting leverage. Protecting hierarchy. Protecting a system that had taken years to build. And then came the ratings. And then came the merchandise lines. And then came NBC. Suddenly, this wasn't about locker room dynamics anymore. It wasn't about rookie hazing or media narratives. It became about something far more dangerous in professional sports. Replaceability. Because while some players were focused on putting her in her place, executives were looking at spreadsheets. While veterans were sending messages through interviews, network executives were watching engagement dashboards explode. And now the face of the most powerful new media deal in women's basketball isn't a 10-year veteran. It isn't a multi-time champion. It's the rookie they tried to humble. And here's the uncomfortable question nobody inside the league wants to say out loud. Did they accidentally fast-track her takeover? Because while the veterans are locked in labor disputes, while negotiations simmer behind closed doors, while strike threats hang in the air, Caitlin Clark is sitting at the NBA table. Not as a guest, as a contributor. That's not symbolism. That's positioning. And positioning is power. But to understand how we got here, how the league's old guard slowly lost narrative control, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when this wasn't about contracts or media rights. Back to when it looked like simple rookie adjustment. Because that's where the real story starts. And it's not the version you've been casually told. The gatekeeping era no one wants to admit happened. The shift didn't start with NBC. It started with energy. You could feel it in the first few weeks of her arrival. The welcome wasn't exactly warm. Now, every league has physical play. Every rookie has to adjust. Nobody denies that. But this felt different. Not harder, different. There were fouls that made headlines. There were moments replayed in slow motion across social media. There were plays that sparked debates not just about basketball, but about intent. And it wasn't just on the court. It was in the interviews. Subtle jabs. Comments about earning it. Comments about not getting special treatment. Comments that sounded normal on the surface, but carried undertones that fans immediately picked up on. And here's what made it more volatile. The fans weren't just watching games. They were documenting patterns. Every clip circulated. Every moment dissected. Every facial expression analyzed. For the first time in WNBA history, a rookie wasn't just stepping into a league. She was stepping into a spotlight the league had never experienced before. And that spotlight changes behavior. Because when attention multiplies, insecurity gets louder. Veterans had spent years building credibility. Years grinding in relative obscurity. Years fighting for visibility, charter flights, respect, pay increases. And now a rookie walks in already famous. Already sponsored. Already drawing sold-out arenas before she played a single professional minute. That's not just competition. That's disruption. And disruption threatens hierarchy. So what do established hierarchies do when disrupted? They test. They enforce. They remind. And that's what many fans believe they were watching. Not competition. Correction. Correction of perceived hype. Correction of narrative imbalance. Correction of attention distribution. But here's where it gets complicated. Because every time a veteran tried to downplay her, the numbers contradicted them. Every time someone said she needed to prove herself, the viewership spiked. Every time someone dismissed her impact, ticket prices climbed. That's when this stopped being about rookie adjustment and started becoming about power preservation. Then came the Olympic conversation. That moment was gasoline on a slow-burning fire. When her name wasn't included, the debate exploded. Analysts argued. Fans erupted. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Some said she hadn't earned it. Others said she had clearly transformed the league's visibility. But what mattered wasn't whether she should have made the team. What mattered was perception. And the perception among a growing segment of fans was this. The establishment was closing ranks. Whether that perception was fair or not almost didn't matter. Because perception drives engagement. Engagement drives ratings. Ratings drive leverage. And leverage is what this entire situation eventually became about. Meanwhile, inside locker rooms, dynamics reportedly grew tense. Social media amplified everything. Podcasts dissected every post-game handshake. And the more tension built, the more attention grew. That's the paradox. Attempts to cool her momentum only fueled it. Every "she's not that special" comment became free marketing. Every hard foul became a viral clip. Every moment of visible frustration became narrative gold. And slowly, something dangerous for the veterans began forming. The audience stopped seeing them as protectors of the game and started seeing them as obstacles to it. That shift wasn't immediate. It was gradual, but it was powerful. Because once fans emotionally attach to someone, any perceived attack on that person feels personal. And that's when loyalty locks in. The league may have thought it was testing her toughness, but what it was really testing was public sentiment. And public sentiment picked a side. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. While players were battling on the court, executives were observing off it. Networks were monitoring trends. Advertisers were tracking sentiment analysis. Because in 2026, sports isn't just about performance. It's about narrative velocity. And Caitlyn's narrative was moving faster than anyone expected. The gatekeeping strategy, whether intentional or instinctive, may have been the moment control quietly slipped. Because instead of dimming her light, it concentrated it. And what happened next would turn tension into transformation. The ratings earthquake that executives couldn't ignore. While players were arguing narratives, the numbers were whispering something very different. And in corporate sports, whispers from data eventually become orders. At first, it looked like a novelty spike. Opening week hype. Rookie curiosity. College carryover buzz. That happens sometimes. But this didn't cool down. It accelerated. Games that previously pulled modest audiences suddenly shattered viewership records. Not incremental growth. Not marginal improvement. Multiples. A regular season matchup became the most watched broadcast in years. Arena attendance didn't just rise, it overflowed. Secondary ticket markets surged. Road games became events. Cities that had never seen sold-out WNBA crowds were scrambling to accommodate demand. And executives noticed surges. But they obsess over patterns. The pattern was clear. When Caitlyn played, numbers spiked. When she didn't, they normalized. That delta? That gap? That's leverage. And leverage is currency. It wasn't just television ratings. It was merchandise velocity. Jerseys moving faster than supply chains could handle. Sneaker anticipation building before launch. Search engine trends dominated by one name. Streaming signups correlating directly with game appearances. That's not fan interest. That's market influence. Now here's the part most fans don't think about. Networks don't evaluate athletes emotionally. They evaluate them in acquisition cost versus retention yield. How many new subscribers? How long do they stay? How often do they return? And most importantly, do they convert into recurring revenue? When NBC and Peacock ran their projections for the new media rights era, they weren't asking, who's the most respected veteran? They were asking, who drives sustained engagement? And sustained engagement has fingerprints. You can see it in minute-by-minute viewership charts. When she checked into games, viewership rose. When games got close late, audiences held. When highlight clips dropped, they trended within minutes. That kind of consistency changes boardroom conversations. Because suddenly this isn't about promoting a league. It's about protecting an asset. And assets get insulated. This is where the psychological shift began behind closed doors. Executives started asking a dangerous question. What if the league needs her more than she needs the league? That question flips power structures upside down. Historically, leagues controlled stars. Contracts controlled movement. Collective bargaining controlled exposure. But in the social media era, brand gravity shifts faster. Caitlyn wasn't just a player. She was a self-sustaining media ecosystem. Her highlights circulated independently of official broadcasts. Her interviews drew millions without league amplification. Her presence alone could anchor a segment. That kind of independence makes executives think differently. Because when one individual begins to represent a disproportionate share of engagement, protecting that individual becomes strategic. And this is where timing collided with tension. At the exact moment ratings were exploding, labor negotiations were tightening, veterans were pushing for larger revenue shares. Strike possibilities floated publicly. Owners were weighing financial exposure. Now imagine you're sitting in that owner's chair. On one side, you have a players' association demanding significant increases. On the other side, you have a singular athlete driving unprecedented growth. Which side has scalable upside? Which side represents risk? Because here's the corporate reality. Strike threats scare advertisers. Instability scares networks. Drama beyond basketball scares sponsors. But stable growth anchored by a marketable star? That excites investors. So when NBC finalized its broader basketball media strategy, it wasn't random that Caitlyn's role expanded. It was insulation. If a labor dispute disrupted the WNBA season, NBC still had a bridge to the audience. If negotiations dragged, Peacock still had a recognizable draw. If veteran tensions escalated publicly, the network still had its clean narrative centerpiece. That's not favoritism. That's contingency planning. And contingency planning signals something deeper. Executives were preparing for separation. Not necessarily permanent separation, but leverage separation. Meaning, the network's growth wouldn't be hostage to collective friction. Now here's where it becomes almost poetic. The very effort some veterans used to minimize her spotlight made her the safest investment. Because throughout the tension, she didn't retaliate publicly. She didn't escalate. She didn't fire back on podcasts. She played. She signed autographs. She showed up to media availability. In a business built on risk management, calm consistency becomes gold. So while some players voiced frustration about pay, travel, respect, Caitlyn became the image of forward-facing growth. And networks reward forward momentum. This is why the NBC contributor role wasn't symbolic. It was structural. It signaled that her brand had graduated beyond single-league dependency. She wasn't just the face of a team. She was becoming a cross-platform personality. And cross-platform personalities hold negotiation power. But here's what most people missed. The ratings surge didn't just empower her. It weakened the old leverage structure. Because collective bargaining power depends on unity. And unity becomes fragile when revenue isn't evenly distributed. When one name drives disproportionate growth, conversations inside union rooms change. Tensions rise. Questions form. Is the growth because of us? Or because of her? That question alone creates instability. And instability creates opportunity. Opportunity for owners. Opportunity for networks. Opportunity for strategic repositioning. So by the time labor tensions escalated publicly, the chessboard had already shifted. Quietly. Incrementally. Mathematically. This wasn't about jealousy anymore. It wasn't about hard fouls or cold interviews. It was about spreadsheets. And spreadsheets don't care about seniority. They care about returns. And what happened next would turn those returns into leverage. Because once executives realized the machine could run through one central engine, they started designing around it. The labor standoff that changed the balance of power. Right when the ratings were exploding, the league walked straight into a storm. The Players Association began pushing harder, louder, publicly. Revenue share increases, salary restructuring, travel standards, long-term guarantees, bigger slices of the new media pie. On the surface, it made sense. The league was growing. Money was flowing in. Players wanted their share. But timing in business is everything. Because while negotiations were heating up behind closed doors, one name was disproportionately responsible for the visible growth. That's not disrespect. That's math. And when math enters collective bargaining, things get complicated. Historically, unions hold power through unity. Strength in numbers. Shared leverage. The idea that the league cannot function without all of them. But what happens when the public perception shifts? What happens when fans start believing the league can function, or at least draw ratings, around one central figure? That's when leverage fragments. Now imagine the owners sitting at that negotiation table. They hear demands for 30% revenue share. They hear strike threats whispered through media channels. They hear rhetoric about fairness and equity. But they also see something else. They see NBC placing Caitlyn Clark on national NBA broadcasts. They see Peacock structuring promotional campaigns around her image. They see social metrics showing sustained engagement, even when labor tension headlines dominate. And that changes the calculation. Because if a strike happens and Caitlyn remains visible on NBC platforms, the growth engine doesn't completely stall. That's the uncomfortable part. In past eras, a league shutdown meant silence. Total blackout. Loss of momentum. But now the biggest star in the sport has cross-league exposure. If games pause, she still speaks. If negotiations drag, she still appears. If the union tries to apply pressure through absence may not hit as hard. That's leverage erosion. And once owners sense leverage erosion, they negotiate differently. Calmer, slower, less reactive. Because they aren't negotiating from fear anymore. They're negotiating from insulation. This is where some veterans may have realized something had shifted. The narrative they tried to control early in the season had turned into a structural advantage for the very player they resisted. Because the more attention she drew, the more corporate entities built around her. The less dependent networks became on collective harmony. Now here's where it gets even more strategic. Owners don't need to openly side against veterans. They don't need to publicly criticize the union. They just need to diversify exposure. And that's exactly what happened. Instead of marketing the WNBA as a unified brand, the marketing began leaning personality-driven, star-focused, individual-centered. And when leagues shift toward personality marketing, bargaining dynamics shift too. Because personality brands don't shut down when seasons pause. They migrate. They pivot. They adapt. Which means the union's strongest weapon, withholding play, becomes less devastating if the central attraction remains visible elsewhere. This isn't conspiracy. It's contingency. And contingency planning sends a message without saying a word. It says, we have options. That's the moment power tilts. Because the union's leverage relies on the idea that the owners cannot operate without them. But if owners can operate partially, if networks can sustain engagement partially, if sponsors can remain aligned partially, then the negotiating temperature drops. And when temperature drops, urgency fades. And when urgency fades, demands soften. Now add another layer. Incoming rookies. Paige Bucher's looming. Angel Reese already generating engagement. A pipeline forming. Suddenly the league isn't dependent on a static veteran hierarchy. It's entering a rotation era, where personalities cycle faster, where fan loyalty shifts quicker, where youth marketing dominates. Owners see that. Networks definitely see that. And when they see that, long-term contracts get structured differently. Promotional focus narrows. Investment concentrates. Because protecting future growth matters more than preserving past hierarchy. So while veterans may have believed they were negotiating from strength, the external ecosystem had already adapted. That's the part few are willing to say publicly. This wasn't just about salary percentages. It was about narrative control. And narrative control had already shifted. When fans start associating the league's growth with one central name, that name becomes symbolic leverage. Not just in negotiations, but in public perception. And perception shapes bargaining outcomes more than most people realize. Because if a strike were to happen tomorrow, public discourse wouldn't center on league fairness. It would center on, what happens to Caitlin? That question alone shifts sympathy. And sympathy influences pressure. Owners know that. Networks know that. And quietly, that knowledge reshaped the chessboard. The veterans may still hold contractual power. They may still have union backing. They may still command respect internally. But externally, the center of gravity moved. And once gravity moves, everything else slowly orbits around it. But here's the twist. NBC didn't just observe this shift. They accelerated it. And that's where the story turns from negotiation to positioning. NBC's power move that quietly redefined the league. NBC didn't just feature Caitlin Clark. They positioned her. And positioning in media is never accidental. When the announcement dropped that she would be involved in NBA coverage, not just WNBA crossover segments, but actual NBA broadcast integration, it felt symbolic at first. A cool moment, a visibility boost, a nice gesture. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a gesture. It was infrastructure. Because think about what that move actually does. It detaches her visibility from the WNBA schedule. It detaches her relevance from union negotiations. It detaches her brand from internal league turbulence. That's not exposure. That's insulation. Historically, star players are elevated through their league. But this was different. This was a network saying, we see standalone value. And once a network sees standalone value, they start building around it. Her NBA appearances weren't framed as novelty. They were framed as legitimacy. Sitting beside legends. Analyzing elite matchups. integrated into a broadcast ecosystem that reaches millions beyond the WNBA core audience. That's expansion. And expansion changes negotiation dynamics permanently. Because once a personality transcends league boundaries, the league no longer controls their ceiling. Now here's where it gets strategic. NBC didn't replace veterans publicly. They didn't issue statements criticizing anyone. They didn't engage in drama. They simply shifted the spotlight. And spotlight allocation is power distribution. In media, whoever receives consistent national framing becomes the narrative anchor. When viewers tune in weekly and see her positioned alongside established NBA voices, something subtle happens psychologically. She stops being a WNBA rookie. She becomes a basketball personality. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because basketball personalities are harder to marginalize, harder to sideline, harder to contain within one bargaining structure. Now think about timing. This expanded role happened while labor tension headlines were circulating, while strike speculation floated, while union negotiations were stiffening. That timing wasn't random. It sent a message, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but structurally. It said, we can continue growth even if internal friction escalates. That's a quiet power flex. And here's the deeper layer most casual fans miss. Streaming platforms operate differently than traditional television. They rely on retention loops. Personalities create retention loops. Leagues create seasonal spikes. But personalities create recurring engagement. By integrating Caitlyn into NBA programming, NBC ensured year-round visibility, year-round conversation, year-round algorithm presence. That's long-term brand anchoring. And when a network anchors a personality long-term, they invest differently. They promote differently. They protect differently. Which leads to a tough realization. The more valuable she becomes outside the WNBA structure, the less vulnerable she becomes inside it. That shifts bargaining leverage dramatically. Because now if negotiations become contentious, she isn't trapped within league silence. She has another microphone, another stage, another audience. Owners know this. Union leaders know this. Veterans definitely know this. And that awareness changes internal dynamics. Now here's where perception becomes critical. To some fans, this looked like reward. To others, it looked like favoritism. But to executives, it looked like asset protection. Because controversy inside leagues creates volatility. And volatility scares advertisers. But steady, composed public presence across platforms, that attracts investment. And through all the tension, she maintained composure. No explosive interviews. No retaliation segments. No public escalations. That steadiness became currency. And networks reward currency. The optics alone were powerful. While some veterans were publicly frustrated about revenue structures, she was calmly discussing NBA matchups on national television. That contrast speaks loudly without anyone saying a word. And contrast builds narrative momentum. Suddenly, the story wasn't rookie adjusting to league. It was rookie transcending league. That's a different arc entirely. Once that arc solidifies in public consciousness, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. Because fans don't unsee elevation. They don't downgrade someone once they've watched them operate at a higher tier. And NBC knew that. By elevating her platform early, they cemented her trajectory. Now here's the long-term implication. If future media deals revolve around personality-driven ratings, if streaming growth depends on recognizable anchors, if advertisers prefer stable, controversy-resistant faces, then the blueprint shifts. Leagues stop promoting tenure. They start promoting momentum. And momentum currently has a name. That's the structural shift happening right now. Quietly, incrementally, strategically. But this move didn't just impact negotiations or branding. It affected psychology. Inside locker rooms, inside front offices, inside boardrooms. Because once one player crosses into national broadcast territory, the hierarchy recalibrates. And recalibration doesn't happen peacefully. Which brings us to the emotional aftermath. Because corporate strategy is one thing, but human reaction? That's another layer entirely. And what this did to the old guard might be the most dramatic shift of all. The branding war, stability versus volatility. In corporate America, there's one rule that overrides everything else. Risk gets minimized. Growth gets amplified. And when executives evaluate athletes, they don't just look at stats. They look at brand temperature. Is this person stable? Are they predictable? Will advertisers feel safe attaching their logo? Because sponsors don't invest in tension. They invest in trust. Now rewind to the last 2 seasons. The league wasn't just generating highlights. It was generating headlines. Hard fouls went viral. Post-game comments circulated. Olympic omissions sparked debates. Podcast interviews fueled speculation. Whether intentional or not, the WNBA narrative shifted from basketball to conflict. And conflict drives clicks temporarily. But sustained corporate investment? That requires steadiness. This is where the branding divide quietly formed. On one side, you had vocal frustration, public negotiation pressure, statements about fairness and respect. On the other side, you had composure, minimal public reaction, controlled messaging, consistent focus on play. Now to be clear, advocating for better pay isn't wrong. Demanding structural fairness isn't wrong. But branding doesn't reward complexity. It rewards clarity. And clarity in media looks like this. One athlete hits logo threes, smiles in interviews, thanks teammates, and signs autographs for 45 minutes after games. That's easy to market. It's clean. It's aspirational. It's sponsor-friendly. Meanwhile, any perception of internal division creates brand friction. Advertisers don't want to navigate friction. They want seamless alignment. So when networks studied sentiment analysis, they weren't just counting mentions. They were measuring tone. And tone matters more than volume. If fan conversations feel heated, divided, angry, that creates unpredictability. But when fan conversations feel enthusiastic, protective, excited, that creates loyalty. And loyalty converts. That's why this moment became less about basketball skill and more about brand posture. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. In today's media ecosystem, the athlete who controls their emotional output controls their brand trajectory. Through every controversy, she stayed measured. Through every debate, she stayed restrained. Through every provocation, she avoided escalation. That doesn't just build admiration. It builds corporate confidence. And corporate confidence unlocks doors. Now imagine being a veteran watching this unfold. You've put in years, championship runs, all-star appearances, advocacy work, community leadership. But suddenly, the narrative engine isn't centered on tenure. It's centered on tone. And tone is driving revenue. That shift can feel personal. Because branding wars aren't always loud. Sometimes they're silent. Sometimes they're decided in conference rooms where executives slide decks across tables. Slides showing engagement curves. Slides showing demographic expansion. Slides showing advertiser compatibility. And if one face consistently trends upward across all metrics, that face becomes the anchor. It doesn't matter who has more rings. It doesn't matter who's been around longer. Brand anchors are chosen based on future scalability, not past accomplishments. And that's where the generational divide crystallized. The old model was respect through experience. The new model is visibility through virality. And the new model scales faster. Corporate America doesn't hate veterans, but it does prefer predictability. And any narrative labeled toxic, divisive, or volatile becomes a liability in sponsorship calculus. That's not moral judgment. That's marketing math. So when critics say the veterans were cut out, it might be more accurate to say they priced themselves into uncertainty, and uncertainty scares investors. Meanwhile, the rookie positioned herself as stability, and stability gets rewarded. This is why NBC's alignment feels strategic rather than sentimental. They aren't picking sides emotionally. They're picking the safest growth vector. And right now, the safest growth vector is the athlete whose brand isn't entangled in labor rhetoric. That doesn't mean negotiations are wrong. It means branding and bargaining operate on separate tracks. And when those tracks diverge, perception shifts. Now here's the deeper psychological impact. Fans don't consciously process brand calculus, but they feel alignment. They feel who seems optimistic. They feel who seems frustrated. They feel who seems forward-facing. And they gravitate accordingly. Which means even without overt conflict, a quiet rebalancing happens. Attention drifts. Engagement consolidates. Momentum centralizes. And once momentum centralizes around one figure, it becomes self-reinforcing. Because the more she's promoted, the more visible she becomes. The more visible she becomes, the more metrics favor her. The more metrics favor her, the more executives invest. That loop is powerful, and loops are hard to break. but while branding battles unfold in public. The psychological impact behind the scenes can be even more intense. Because imagine spending a decade building status, only to watch the spotlight permanently relocate. That's not just business. That's emotional. And that emotional shift may be the most dramatic part of this entire saga. The psychological shift inside the old guard. Imagine this for a second. You've spent 10 years grinding. Long flights, smaller crowds, limited media coverage, fighting for charter upgrades, fighting for pay raises, fighting for respect. You helped carry the league when cameras weren't always there. You built it when endorsement deals were scarce. You were the face during seasons that barely trended. And then 1 year changes everything. Crowds explode. Media rights deals expand. Sponsors suddenly care. Networks compete for content. But the face of that explosion isn't you. It's a rookie. And not just a rookie. A rookie whose arrival immediately shifted attention away from veterans who waited years for that exact level of visibility. That kind of shift doesn't just hit contracts. It hits identity. Because for years, leadership inside the league wasn't just about performance. It was about hierarchy. Tenure mattered. Championships mattered. All-star selections mattered. There was an unspoken structure. You earn the spotlight over time. You earn marketing priority. You earn respect gradually. But this wasn't gradual. This was instant. And instant elevation disrupts internal equilibrium. Now layer in the NBC integration. Seeing her on NBA broadcasts. Seeing her positioned alongside Hall of Fame level personalities. Seeing her narrative framed as generational. For veterans, that's not just media expansion. That's symbolic displacement. Because perception becomes reality. And once the public perceives someone as the future, everyone else slowly gets reframed as the past. No one wants to be labeled the past. Especially not athletes still competing at elite levels. This is where psychology becomes volatile. Not because of jealousy, but because of relevance. Athletes don't just compete for wins. They compete for legacy, for imprint, for validation that their years mattered. So when a new figure becomes the central gravitational force, it forces an uncomfortable question. Where do I fit now? That question can fracture locker room dynamics quietly. Because leadership that once felt secure now feels transitional. Status that once felt earned now feels threatened. And transitions are rarely smooth, especially when they happen publicly. Now imagine turning on national television and watching the league's newest face sitting comfortably in NBA coverage, smiling, analyzing, integrated, while you're locked in contract disputes, while headlines frame negotiations as combative. The contrast is stark, and contrast sharpens perception. This isn't about whether veterans deserve respect. They absolutely do. But the modern sports ecosystem doesn't reward historical equity. It rewards present magnetism. And magnetism doesn't wait. It accelerates. So what happens psychologically when acceleration bypasses hierarchy? Two things. Some adapt. Some resist. Those who adapt align themselves with the momentum. They collaborate. They publicly support. They position themselves as mentors in the narrative. And that can preserve relevance. But those who resist, they risk being framed as obstacles to growth. And once that framing sets in publicly, it's hard to shake. Because fan loyalty is emotional. And fans who feel protective of a rising star become defensive quickly. Now here's where it gets even more layered. The younger rookies entering the league aren't blind to this shift. They see engagement numbers. They see social media followings. They see endorsement opportunities. They see cross-platform visibility. And they understand instinctively that aligning with momentum creates opportunity. Which means the internal balance of influence shifts generation by generation. Quietly, without formal announcements. Suddenly, leadership conversations change tone. Marketing conversations change focus. Media availability rotates differently. The center of gravity moves. And once gravity moves, orbit follows. For veterans, that can feel isolating. Not because they've lost skill, but because they've lost narrative dominance. And narrative dominance in the social media era is almost as powerful as statistical dominance. Now here's the part no one says publicly. When the spotlight consolidates around one player, everyone else competes for peripheral attention. That's not disrespect. That's bandwidth limitation. There's only so much promotional oxygen in a sports cycle. And when one figure absorbs most of it, others get less. That can breed frustration. It can breed tension. It can breed strategic resistance. But resistance to momentum rarely wins long-term, because momentum is reinforced by metrics. And metrics don't care about feelings. They care about engagement. So while the old guard may still command respect inside the locker room, the external ecosystem has already recalibrated. And once the external ecosystem shifts, internal power eventually follows. This is how eras end. Not with announcements, not with retirement ceremonies, but with slow spotlight migration. The era of gatekeeping is being replaced by the era of acceleration. And acceleration doesn't ask permission. But here's what makes this moment historic. It's not just about veterans adjusting. It's about whether the league structure itself is being rewritten. Because if one player can transcend collective bargaining gravity, if one personality can operate independently of seasonal volatility, if one brand can anchor network strategy, then we're not just watching a generational shift. We're watching a structural evolution. And structural evolution changes everything, including who becomes replaceable. The replacement theory, why owners may not be afraid anymore. For years, the power dynamic in the WNBA was simple. The league needed its veterans, their credibility, their championships, their leadership, their voices. They were the pillars holding up a still-growing structure. And because of that, they had leverage. But leverage only holds when replacement feels impossible. That's the core principle in any labor negotiation. If management believes talent is scarce, they negotiate cautiously. If management believes talent is renewable, they negotiate strategically. And right now, talent looks renewable. Not because veterans lack skill, but because the pipeline is suddenly flooded with marketable personalities. Paige Buecher's waiting in the wings. Angel Reese already drawing engagement. A new generation entering with built-in college followings, nil branding experience, and social media fluency. This isn't the rookie class of 2015. This is the nil era. These athletes enter professional leagues already understanding branding, algorithm leverage, and audience building. That changes the supply curve. Owners see that. Networks definitely see that. Because if fan loyalty begins attaching to personalities earlier, during college careers, then transition into the WNBA becomes less risky. It becomes plug-and-play. And plug-and-play talent reduces fear. Now combine that with the Caitlin effect. One rookie didn't just elevate herself. She elevated the visibility of incoming classes. Sponsors now see the women's college-to-pro pipeline as viable marketing territory. Media executives see draft nights as ratings events. Streaming platforms see potential subscription waves aligned with rookie debuts. That changes bargaining posture dramatically. Because if management believes the next star is one draft away, they feel less pressure in negotiations with current veterans. Again, this isn't about disrespect. It's about elasticity. If demand can be met with emerging supply, urgency softens. Now here's where the theory becomes controversial. Some analysts quietly believe owners have already modeled worst-case scenarios. What happens if a strike occurs? What happens if several veterans sit out? Would viewership collapse entirely? Or would curiosity around rookies sustain engagement? Would fans boycott? Or would fans tune in regardless? Owners don't guess. They simulate. They run projections. They test hypotheticals. And if projections show resilience, even without certain veteran figures, that shifts negotiation confidence. Now layer NBC into this equation. If the network can promote Caitlin independently, if they can integrate other rookies into cross-platform coverage, if they can build personalities before conflicts escalate, then the league's dependence on a singular veteran hierarchy diminishes. That's the uncomfortable reality of replacement theory. It's not about replacing skill. It's about replacing leverage. And leverage is what's actually being renegotiated right now. Because in previous eras, veterans controlled narrative access. They were the face of promotional tours. They were the voice of player activism. They were the central interviews. Now, media access routes through younger stars. Engagement routes through social-first athletes. Highlight culture routes through shareable moments. The attention economy has flattened hierarchy. And flattened hierarchy reduces fear. If owners are less afraid of disruption, they negotiate from stability. If they negotiate from stability, demands lose urgency. And when urgency fades, the tone of bargaining changes. Now here's what makes this moment historic. For decades, leagues operated as collective ecosystems. The brand was bigger than any individual. But today, individuals can eclipse the ecosystem. If one player can carry national attention alone, if incoming rookies bring built-in audiences, if streaming platforms prefer personality-driven marketing, then the ecosystem decentralizes. And decentralized ecosystems reduce union leverage. That doesn't mean unions become powerless, but it does mean leverage becomes fragmented, which leads to the most important question of all. What happens when leagues stop fearing absence? Because absence has always been labor's strongest weapon. But if absence doesn't eliminate engagement, its power weakens. That's the chessboard right now. Quiet, calculated, strategic. And while public debates focus on fairness, respect, and jealousy, behind closed doors, executives are calculating replaceability curves. Not because they want to eliminate veterans, but because they want optionality. Optionality creates confidence. Confidence shifts power. And power is what this entire saga has been about from the beginning. But here's the twist. Even if owners feel less afraid, that doesn't mean the future is guaranteed. Because when power concentrates too heavily in one figure, new risks emerge. And that leads us to the next evolution of this story. The era of the individual, when one star outgrows the system. For decades, leagues controlled the spotlight. The logo came first. The players rotated underneath it. Stars were elevated, yes, but always within the structure. The system was bigger than the individual. That model worked in the pre-digital era. But the digital era rewrote the rules. Now attention doesn't flow from leagues downward. It flows from personalities outward. Social media didn't just give athletes a voice. It gave them independence. And independence changes hierarchy. Because when a player can generate millions of views without league amplification, when their highlights trend organically, when their interviews circulate without official promotion, the system no longer controls narrative velocity. The individual does. Caitlin Clark represents that shift perfectly. She didn't just enter the WNBA. She entered with a self-sustaining audience. College fans followed her. Casual sports fans followed her. Non-traditional WNBA viewers followed her. She brought new eyes. And new eyes don't carry historical loyalty. They attach to faces, not institutions. That's the structural change happening right now. The league isn't just growing. It's decentralizing. Because when fan allegiance attaches to individuals first, the institution becomes secondary. And institutions that become secondary lose negotiation dominance. Now this isn't unique to the WNBA. The NBA experienced it with LeBron. The NFL sees it with quarterbacks. Combat sports revolve entirely around personalities. But what makes this moment different is timing. The WNBA was still solidifying its collective identity, still negotiating structural equity, still building unified leverage. And suddenly, one figure accelerated the spotlight beyond collective control. That creates tension, because unions thrive on collective leverage. But personality-driven ecosystems thrive on individual leverage. Those forces don't always align. Now imagine future rookies entering this landscape. They see what happened. They see cross-platform exposure. They see endorsement acceleration. They see how one athlete transcended seasonal boundaries. And they internalize a new blueprint. Build your brand early. Own your audience. Diversify your exposure. Don't rely solely on league marketing. That mindset shift alone alters the power map permanently. Because once athletes realize they can build independent ecosystems, their loyalty to collective structures becomes more strategic, not emotional. Strategic loyalty negotiates differently. Strategic loyalty hedges risk. And hedged risk weakens centralized authority. Now here's the paradox. The league benefits massively from this visibility explosion. Revenue grows. Media deals expand. Sponsorship interest increases. But at the same time, the concentration of attention around one figure introduces dependency risk. Because what happens if that individual gets injured? What happens if public sentiment shifts? What happens if the next rookie overtakes current momentum? Decentralized ecosystems are powerful, but they're volatile. That's why networks move quickly to secure personalities early. And that's exactly what NBC appears to be doing. By integrating her into NBA coverage, they aren't just capitalizing on hype. They're future-proofing. They're making sure their growth isn't confined to one league's internal politics. That's a major structural evolution, because it means the most marketable athlete in the WNBA now operates partially outside its ecosystem. That's unprecedented territory. and unprecedented territory creates new rules. Which brings us to the next inevitable question. If this shift continues, if personality-driven power keeps expanding, if rookie pipelines remain strong, then what happens next? Do we see collaboration? Do we see fragmentation? Do we see a full reset of bargaining power? Because revolutions in sports rarely announce themselves. They unfold gradually, until one day you look back and realize the structure never looked the same again. And that's exactly where we are right now, on the edge of something irreversible. If the strike happens, three futures that could redefine the league. Right now, tension sits just beneath the surface. Negotiations, revenue splits, structural demands, long-term guarantees. Publicly, everyone says the right things. Privately, everyone is calculating. Because if a strike actually happens, it won't just pause games. It will test power. And there are only three realistic paths forward. Scenario 1. The strike happens and momentum fractures. If veterans walk out and the season stalls, the immediate headline will be about fairness, about revenue distribution, about respect. But the deeper storyline will revolve around visibility. Does the spotlight fade? Or does it shift? If Caitlyn remains active on NBC broadcasts, if cross-platform exposure continues, if fans still see her weekly, then absence won't feel absolute. And if absence doesn't feel absolute, the leverage impact softens. That would be a historic shift. Because for decades, labor power in sports has relied on total stoppage. But if modern media allows partial continuity through personality-driven exposure, then traditional strike pressure loses force. That doesn't mean the union loses, but it does mean the battlefield changes. And once the battlefield changes, negotiation outcomes shift. Scenario 2, a negotiated reset, but with new power dynamics. The more likely outcome? A deal gets done. Revenue increases happen. Structural improvements get announced. Everyone claims victory. But beneath the press conferences, something fundamental has changed. Owners now understand they have alternative engagement pathways. Networks understand personality anchors drive subscriptions. Players understand independent brand building is essential. That means the next negotiation won't look like the last one. The league will no longer operate purely as a collective power structure. It will operate as a hybrid, part union ecosystem, part personality economy. And hybrid systems are harder to control. Scenario 3, the era of permanent star-centric power. This is the most transformative possibility. The league fully embraces the star-first model. Marketing consolidates around the biggest personalities. Media deals structure around individuals. Rookies enter expecting cross-platform exposure from day one. Veteran hierarchy dissolves faster. The old guard doesn't disappear, but it no longer dictates narrative flow. In that world, gatekeeping becomes obsolete. Momentum becomes currency. And whoever holds the most attention holds the most influence. If that happens, we won't just look back at this season as dramatic. We'll look back at it as the pivot point. Now step back for a moment. Strip away the emotion. Strip away the online debates. Strip away the podcast clips. What are we really watching? We're watching a league confront modern media reality in real time. A reality where attention is concentrated, where algorithms amplify individuals, where networks invest in personalities over institutions, and where one rookie walked into that reality perfectly positioned. This isn't about revenge. It isn't about canceling veterans. It isn't even about jealousy. It's about acceleration. Caitlyn Clark accelerated visibility faster than the structure was prepared for. And when acceleration outpaces structure, friction happens. The veterans weren't prepared for it. The league wasn't fully prepared for it. Even the networks were surprised by the magnitude. But once the numbers stabilized, once the engagement held, once the sponsorship interest solidified, the machine adjusted. And machines adjust toward growth. That's the part that makes this moment historic. Because they may have tried to humble her early. They may have tried to slow the hype. They may have tried to protect the hierarchy. But in doing so, they intensified the spotlight. And intensified spotlights don't shrink. They expand. Now the league stands at a crossroads. It can embrace the evolution. It can recalibrate around hybrid power. Or it can resist and risk fragmentation. But one thing is already clear. The center of gravity has moved. The era of quiet gatekeeping is over. The era of amplified individuals has arrived. And whether you love it or hate it, it's not reversing. So the real question isn't whether veterans were cut. It's whether this was always inevitable. Because in the age of algorithms, momentum always finds its champion. And once momentum finds its champion, everything else reorganizes around it. If you've made it this far, you already see the shift happening. And this is just the beginning. Because the next season won't just be about wins and losses. It'll be about power, about branding, about who truly controls the future of the league. And if you want deep breakdowns when that next chapter unfolds, when negotiations conclude, when rookie pipelines collide with veteran legacy, when the ratings numbers hit again, make sure you subscribe. Because this story isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. And you're going to want to see where it lands next.